By the end of 1918, the government of the Ottoman Empire had collapsed and its leaders had fled the country. Defeat in World War I was to see their empire be carved up by European powers, but nearly as soon as their occupations began, furious Ottoman Turks began to resist. Under the command of Mustafa Kemal, they would defy some of the most powerful countries on Earth, raising an interesting question: how? How could Kemal's Turkish nationalists beat the Entente and supplant the Ottoman Sultanate? How did Atatürk start and win the Turkish War of Independence? Well, the Ottoman Empire entered World War I as a shell of its former self. In the previous 100 years, they'd lost the Balkans to independence movements, Egypt and North Africa, and generally been treated as a pawn by Europe's great powers. Attempts by a number of sultans at modernizing their state had not been enough to prevent that, and in 1908, the last one to wield sovereign power, Abdülhamid II, was forced to sign a constitution and then abdicate. That was the Young Turk Revolution, led by the Committee of Union and Progress, and it created, in theory, a parliamentary state. In practice, by the outbreak of war, the empire was a dictatorship ran by a triumvirate of the CUP's leaders, the three pashas. The new sultan was largely a figurehead. So the Young Turk program was something of a predecessor to Kemalism. They wanted to modernize, specifically secularize and increasingly Turkify the Ottoman state, and to remove meddling Europeans from Ottoman territory. Regarding that second point in particular, the Young Turk regime would screw up. Their revolution had been inspired by decades of decline, but it didn't halt it. Defeat to Italy in 1912 and then the Balkan League in 1913 made it clear that the empire was vulnerable. They had no allies, and the powers of the Triple Entente had no interest in their preservation. It was not out of totally unmerited fear, then, that as war loomed in July 1914, Enver Pasha signed Constantinople up to a secret alliance with Berlin, the Germans already having influence in the Ottoman army. By November, the Ottomans were using German vessels to shell Russian ports and were officially in World War I as a central power. The war would not go well for the Turks, however, and by late 1918 their army was exhausted, undersupplied, and afflicted by disease. The only real Ottoman triumphs had been repelling British Commonwealth forces at the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. Incidentally, that's where Mustafa Kemal, or Atatürk, first distinguished himself as a commander. Elsewhere, though, it was pretty bad. The Great Arab Revolt, eagerly aided by the British, pushed the Ottomans out of most of the Arab world. Britain and Russia checked them in nominally neutral Persia. Greece joined the war against them in 1917, and while the Russian Revolution allowed for fleeting success in the Caucasus, an Entente army was being assembled west in Thessaloniki. It pushed through the Macedonian front in September 1918. So, with Constantinople exposed and their allies capitulating or disintegrating, the Ottoman Empire sought peace in October. The armistice that ended the fighting on October 30th was, in effect, an unconditional surrender. An Allied High Commission was set up to govern Constantinople and control the Sultan, who appointed a new, pro-Entente, Ottoman government. By then, the Levant, Palestine, and the rest of the Ottoman Arab territories had effectively ceased to be part of the empire, while elsewhere, British, French, and Italian troops were sent to occupy pre-agreed-on areas. That constituted the start of a partition plan that Mustafa Kemal would fight to reject. Greek troops were allowed to join the occupation in force in 1919, when it became clear that Turkish resistance wouldn't be light. Ironically, though, Greece's presence was particularly antagonizing to the Turkish nationalists, and it helped Kemal unite various disparate factions. Why? Well, because the other powers clearly wanted influence in Turkey, but Greece, by right of their own nationalistic cause, the Megalea, was intent on fully incorporating plenty of land the Turks considered to rightfully be theirs. In defeat, the regime of the CUP and the three pashas had collapsed. The triumvirate went into exile, and all three were assassinated by Armenians within just a few years. Their fall from grace opened the way for Mustafa Kemal to take charge of Turkey. But not from Constantinople. There, Mehmed VI, the very last Ottoman Sultan, had taken the view that he had no choice but to fully cooperate with the Entente. That was not a view shared by the Turkish people, however, and Kemal's supporters, the Turkish National Movement, began to set up a rival Ottoman government based in Ankara. For now, they remained ostensibly loyal subjects, but were already skirmishing with the officially sanctioned occupation forces. Furious at having their country invaded, at conferences in Erzurum and Sivas in mid-1919, the nationalists officially spelt out the principles they would fight for. The National Pact, passed by the last Ottoman Parliament, called for the complete independence of a Turkish state, without either the behind-the-scenes foreign control that afflicted them pre-war, or the occupations they were enduring in the moment. The Treaty of SRA, signed in 1920, formally ended the war between the Entente and the Ottomans. It also lit a fire beneath the nationalist movement. SRA was not to be negotiated, but imposed by the Entente, and the plan was very much to truncate the Ottoman Empire. It would hardly resemble what it did in 1914. The Arab world was lost to become British and French mandates, plus the Kingdom of Hejaz around Mecca and Medina. The Armenians were to receive a state in eastern Anatolia and the Caucasus, while Greece was to get Thrace just up to the outskirts of Constantinople. The city and the Turkish Straits would remain nominally Ottoman territory, but as an international zone, largely under British influence. Most of the rest of Anatolia was also parceled out into spheres of influence for the victorious powers, with plans to set up an autonomous Kurdistan in the east, and eventually for the Greek zone around the city of Smyrna to be annexed outright. SRA's terms were never implemented. To the Turkish nationalists, the treaty was outrageous, and the Ottoman parliament elected in 1919 made it clear that they felt that way. So, the occupying powers simply had the Sultan dissolve it and rule as their puppet by decree. The problem was that everyone knew he was their puppet, which made the ruling difficult. Dissolving the nationalist-led parliament shattered the legitimacy of the government in Constantinople and prompted the Turkish National Movement in Ankara to officially declare itself the actual government, as Turkish society rallied around them. In May 1920, they elected a new body, the Grand National Assembly, and voted in Kemal as their president. That said, they had not yet formally deposed Mehmed VI. Still, Constantinople gave Kemal and plenty of his supporters death sentences in absentia for treason. In turn, the Grand National Assembly stripped all of the signers of the Treaty of SRA of their Turkish citizenship. So, unlike the rest of the war-weary Entente, Greece was going to put up a serious fight for territorial concessions. The Greek landings around Smyrna in 1919 mark the start of the Turkish War of Independence, and they had expanded their zone far beyond the city by June 1920. But the greco-turkish war wasn't Kemal's only theatre. In the south, French forces were attempting to subdue Arabs in Syria and Kemal in Cilicia, though by late 1921 momentum was with the Turks. Both France and Italy were plagued with domestic problems, aftershocks from the Great War, and Italy in particular was teetering on the edge. That would see them both out of Turkey by the start of 1922, effectively recognizing Atatürk's government. The nationalists also had to deal with their eastern flank. There they fought primarily against Armenians, who had a pretty good reason for opposing Turkish expansion. From 1915 onwards, partly out of frustration at advances by Tsarist Russia, partly because of an influx of wretched, angry Muslim refugees from lost Ottoman Balkan provinces, and in very large part because of the brutal nature of the CUP's ethnic Turkish nationalism, Armenians became the targets of terror. At least several 100,000, and up to well over 1 million, were killed by official Ottoman forces and civilians, or else deported and allowed to die by neglect during and in the years after World War I. In fighting the First Armenian Republic, Kemal found an ally in Russia's Bolsheviks. They were both enemies of the Western powers and signed a treaty of friendship and support in 1921. Together, nationalist Turkey under Atatürk and the soon-to-be Soviet Union under Lenin carved up the Caucasus. The Turks regained Kars, which had been lost to Russia in 1878, and with the Bolsheviks they partitioned lands that would have gone to the Armenian Republic under Sevra. That left Greece and Britain as Kemal's remaining serious opponents. The Greek army still controlled western Anatolia and Thrace, while the British had Mehmed VI's government under watch in Constantinople. The front in the west had also been bloody, entire villages were razed to the ground, and both sides killed civilians, though the nationalists very intentionally targeted Greeks as they had Armenians. Aiming to wipe them out from Anatolia, they killed hundreds of thousands. The end of the war would see something like 1.5 million people made into refugees. Backed by the British, Greece had launched a successful summer offensive in 1920, a response to Ankara's rejection of the Constantinople government, and they secured a border region around the official Greek occupation zone. 9 months later, as Atatürk was making his deal with the Soviets, the Greeks started another offensive in the west. This time, the goal was to take Ankara and decapitate the nationalist movement. And at first, they were largely successful. The Turks, under Kemal's right-hand man, İsmet İnönü, were forced back across the countryside, though he did prevent the Greeks from advancing towards the Black Sea. Still, Greece continued through the summer of 1921 until they met nationalist forces entrenched on the Sakarya River in August. By that point, both Greece and Turkey had been fighting someone for a decade. A generation of men on both sides had been scarred by war, not to mention the devastation to civilian society. But there would be no ceasefire in 1921, and the war would be decided in part by each nation's ability to maintain national cohesion and the will to fight. Unlike the empire under the absolutist sultans and the Young Turk regime, Atatürk's Turkish National Movement had won the hearts and minds of Turks, rallying them in defense of their homeland. Of course, it helped that a decade of brutal, often murderous policies towards ethnic minorities had left that homeland much more Turkish. The nationalists also had the advantage of a charismatic and capable leader in Kemal. Greek politics, on the other hand, had been afflicted since 1913 by a fierce rivalry between a liberal faction under Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos and a conservative one under King Constantine I. That tore the Greek state apart, literally. For 2 years it endured a semi-civil war. In 1917, Venizelos achieved control, Constantine abdicated, and Greece entered World War I, but their problems weren't over, as the king's son, Alexander, died of monkey bite-induced sepsis 3 years later. Venizelos lost the next elections, and Constantine returned to prosecute the war against Atatürk at the head of a Venizelist army. The Sakarya River was the last natural barrier between the Greeks and Ankara, and for 3 weeks they fought the Turkish nationalists for the right to cross it, but Kemal's men held. Sakarya was a disaster for Greece. They could advance no farther. Meanwhile, Kemal regrouped, Constantine's well-known Germanophilia won Greece no powerful allies, and a year later, the nationalists' great offensive smashed Greek forces, pushing them back to the Aegean in just over a week. At the gates of Constantinople, Kemal ordered British forces out. They left only about 2 hours before the shooting was to start. The Grand National Assembly then formally deposed the Ottoman dynasty, and a triumphant Mustafa Kemal became president of the Republic of Turkey. Sevra was torn up, and a new agreement, the Treaty of Lausanne, confirmed Turkey's borders. Kemal was given the surname Atatürk, Father of the Turks, by the Assembly a decade later. The Greeks never did manage to reclaim Constantinople, today's Istanbul, but you can find out how Greece did grow in the video to the left. If you like this one, it should be right up your alley, and as always, I've been James, and thank you for watching Look Back History.